all seen our special guest today. She's up here on the big screen now. Nevertheless, I'm going to do a little formal introduction today. So, and afterwards, I'll give the podium to Nora. Yes, maybe some of you were expecting that Nora would be here in person today, but we all know what kind of times there are. So she is here. We got the best part of her. All parts of her are great, but we got the best part of her, and that's her voice and her mind and her giggle. Let me see if we hear you.
I was asking if you could hear me, but I had my mute button on, and this is just our times, right? It's going to be really interesting when we start doing this in person, and we have to tell each other, "You're muted." I am so grateful to be here, and thanks to Jan for making the connections that made the connections that made the connections, and Ila, and this whole project that you're beginning sounds terrific, and it's an honor to be here at the beginning of it. And I thought I would just give a little bit of an introduction into the idea of care through a warm data lens, okay? And give you at the same time kind of a little bit of information around kind of what's under this process, because I think that could be interesting for you. So I want to start with this question of care, because care sounds nice. But care can be really insulting. Care can be diminishing. Care is not always nice. Thinking that you know what's best for somebody else is very often a recipe for the end of that relationship. And so what does it mean to care in such a way that relationships themselves are nourished, that there is a mutuality of learning taking place, and to think about care not just as in I am going to care for you, or we are going to care for the environment, but to bring the living complexity into that, so the care itself is alive. Okay, this idea of warm data is not about quantitative information, and it's not really about qualitative information. It's asking the question, what is information like when it's alive? How can we best serve the living systems we live within with care that's alive, information that's alive, and paying attention to the history that has given us these blocks of ideas of what a solution is, to tag on the end of a problem to make a direct corrective, and how wildly out of sync that is with how a meadow continues to be a meadow, how an ecology with all these organisms in relationship are somehow producing care for each other and for the meadow itself, for themselves. What is an ecology of care? So I thought I would start, with climate at the front of this. Let's start with the idea of an ecology. What is an ecology? And, we're pretty comfortable with that idea. Now we think we know what we're talking about. And one way that my dad used to describe ecologies, my father, Gregory Bateson, wrote a book called Steps to an Ecology of Mind 50 years ago. And he thought a lot about this in terms of how an ecology can be seen the way that Goethe explained that if you want to look at a stem, it's something that has buds in its angles, so it's in relationship. So looking at the description of an ecology as through relationship. If you look at a deer with antlers, And this deer has these antlers for its protection, right? The purpose is protection. And that deer can scare away a mountain lion, or it can, have a fight with another deer. But that deer can also take those antlers and rub it against bark. And it makes it possible for particular insects to live there. Those antlers are attractive to the female deers, and they become part of the process of making baby deers and continuing the deers. When the antlers fall off the deer's head and they fall to the forest floor, they become home to lots of organisms, and eventually they become food to organisms. The rodents and the ground creatures begin to eat the antlers, and it gives them minerals. And when those little creatures poop, that poop goes into the soil, and it brings added mineral content for the trees and the forest to continue. So if you start there and you ask the question, where's the edge of the deer? Where's the edge of the deer? And notice the way that in natural processes of care, there is no single purposed, no direct corrective. There is no single purpose. For every one of those organisms involved in that relationship with the deer, there's lots more organisms. So I want to take this moment to get out of the idea that care is something you do to produce a particular result, and to step into the warm data of this, the transcontextual process itself, the ecology of care. Where is the care? What does care look like when it's really in an ecological process? I think that this is probably the great question of our time, because after a couple hundred years of industrialized thinking, our notions of how to make a solution, what is a corrective, what does it mean for me to give care to you or for us to fix something that's broken, these ideas have become, first of all, too singular, far too singular. Nature doesn't operate in those singularities. And second of all, too linear. So how do we begin to understand care in another way? And if we want to respond to the complexity of life, the way that we respond has to also be alive. Okay, so with the International Bateson Institute, we started off with a question, and we as a group of researchers, and we thought we were very clever, and we thought we had like the most important question that we could possibly research, and that question seemed good at the time. The question was, how do systems get unstuck? Okay, how do systems get unstuck? The education system is stuck. The financial system is stuck. The health system is stuck. The economic system is stuck. Right, you name it, it's stuck. And so we thought, this is good. So what we're going to do is we're going to work on the complexity of how you really get things moving again when they're stuck. Because they're stuck from multiple directions, right? An ecology of stuckness. And what we realized pretty quickly is that wasn't a very good question. It sounded like it was going to be, but it wasn't. And I'll tell you why it wasn't. It wasn't a good question because when you look at the stuck part, you can see that there is a kind of stillness or stagnation. But when you look out further in the system, you see that there's all sorts of change taking place that in order to keep something stuck, it takes a lot of change. In order to keep something stuck, it takes a lot of change. If you have, for an example, a family in which they're dealing with an addiction is a kind of stuckness. In order to keep that family in relationship, there's all kinds of changes that people have to go through, the kids and the mom and or the dad and the people, the friends, the family, the work colleagues, to cover for appointments missed or weird behavior, or right? There's all sorts of things that have to change around the edges to keep something still. If you look at the global economy, in order to keep that particular rise, there is all sorts of change at the margins, exploitation to natural processes and people who are going through all kinds of changes to keep those products on the shelf at the same price, right? So in order to keep something stuck, it takes a lot of change. All right. So we thought, okay, let's continue with this exploration. And we went to a clinic in Italy where they work with paralysis. And I don't know if any of you have ever worked with paralysis, but one of the things that you often see in paralysis is that there is, let's see if I can step up, a kind of like a frozen arm with the part of the body that is in paralysis, unless it's a more of a quadriplegic paralysis. But there's a frozen, there are parts of the body that are locked. And we thought, okay, but that's as close as we can get really to an example of a living system that is stuck. And so this clinic was working with ideas of my father's, and I want to invite you to just explore this notion of care and healing with me. So, contrary to popular and orthodox traditional ways of working with paralysis, the one thing these people did not do is go to the frozen arm or the frozen place and try to unfreeze it. They did not put acupuncture or physical therapy or massage or anything else to try to open the arm or to try to make the paralysis go away. Not at all. And that's very interesting. What they did instead, and there was nothing beeping, there's not a lot of drugs going on in there. What they did instead, I'm going to show you because it revolutionized my thinking. It was the first time I ever felt like, oh, that's how a complex system works. So I want to share with you, so maybe you can take this with you somehow. Okay, so let's say you have a patient and you have the practitioner. And the practitioner has a small wooden block. Can you imagine that this is a small wooden block? And instead of a white line, this is a carving of a spiral. Can you imagine that for me? All right. Now, what the practitioner would do is the practitioner would say to the patient, without touching this block, can you describe to me what it would feel like to run your finger around this spiral? Okay, can you describe to me? So what happens at that point is that the person who's in paralysis has to engage multiple forms of cognition: visual, memory, verbal, tactile, right? Lots of different kinds of communication and relationship are activated in making that description. And then the practitioner would take their hand, if they had one that still had feeling, and move it very slowly around the spiral. And when they got to the end of the spiral, they would ask the question, not what did you feel, but what was the difference? What was the difference, okay? And in that next level of description, the patient needs to have in mind what they thought they were going to feel, what they actually felt, and the whole cognitive multiple process of description of that. Are you with me? So that what's happening in the person, the whole person, is that there is this reconnection going on, where the verbal processes are reconnecting to the visual processes, to memory, to touch, to relationship with the practitioner. Okay, can you see how this is a little bit like that antler story? That there are multiple processes of cognition that are being activated and brought together. There is an ecology of cognition, of sensing. And as those aspects of the ecology are making relationship, there is healing. I hope you can see how those two things are alike. And so what we realized was that we were asking the wrong question. And the question really was not how do systems get unstuck? No. The question was how do systems learn? How do systems learn? The whole system. When you learn to play violin, where is the learning? Is it in your muscles? Is it in the history of the instrument? Is it intellectual? Is it in relationship to the violin teacher? Is it because you got your heart broken and you can feel that music? Is it cultural? Is it in the music itself? Where's the learning? And of course, it's in the way all of those things come together, right? So what I want to do is I want to bring in, I'm hoping that in the last 10 minutes, I've kind of blurred your edges a little bit already. And that what we're starting to look at here is that things that take place in living systems take place in multiple ways simultaneously. And so when we think about what care is, one of the most exquisite things that I saw in that paralysis clinic was the way in which all these different possibilities in the being, their sight, their intellect, their emotion, their verbal skills, their physical body, their memory, that all of these aspects of them had to be in a kind of mutual learning. They were all changing at once. It wasn't like they had one exercise for visual, one exercise for emotional, one exercise for verbal. In this little project, all of these processes had to be activated and mutually learn, mutually shift. It's fascinating. Okay, so what I started to recognize, first I just want to say that there was a moment when I was in that clinic and I thought, well, actually, what is a pathology? When we talk about something being wrong with something, what is that? What's a pathology? And so I asked these people, what in your definition, what's a pathology? Because clearly the pathology was not the arm, right? They didn't go straight to that arm to try to fix it and open it. So what was it? Where were they perceiving this? And their response, I thought, was really beautiful, and I invite you to explore this idea. And they said, a pathology is an organism's inability to make sense of its world. Pathology is an organism's inability to make sense of its world. So what they were doing, the care, if you will, that they were producing, was the care of creating the conditions in which this organism would, through multiple contexts of learning, learn to be in its world in a new way. Learn to make sense of its world in a new way. That every one of us is being who we have to be because this is the way we have learned to be in our world. And so there is a relationship between creating those contexts of mutual learning and healing, care. Now, this is completely not what was bred at the turn of the century when the industrialism and the eugenics were coming in and isolating the individual, and we have to fix the broken individual, and right? This is not that. This is a whole different way of thinking about where that healing is coming from. I'm going to share a couple of slides with you. Ila, how much more time do I have?
As much as you like.
Okay. Are you guys doing okay?
Everybody's so quiet.
I know, they're so quiet, but are you doing okay? It's okay. So far, you're with me. Do you have any questions so far?
Many and none.
Okay, that's perfect. Yeah, okay. I'm gonna start here. So I can share screen, right? Okay. All right. So I would like to bring in this idea that I've been playing with for the past few years of thinking about communication itself as an ecology. The way that we're in communication and relationship with each other is what makes us do the things we do all day and live the way we live all day and the way we will next week and the way we did last week. So looking at, instead of trying to change the parts, okay, of the system, looking at what's in the relationships of the system and what's possible in the communication. And so immediately what I would like to invite you to do is just to think about, think about a conversation or a situation you were in yesterday, and instead of thinking of it as a transcript of things that got said, think of it instead as a kind of ecology, as a relationship of tone, of things that it was possible to say, things that were not possible to say, and the way that you brought things into that relationship, into that communication, a smile, a gesture, a question, a statement. And what did your input into that ecology of communication, what did it bring in? If it were a garden you were tending, what did your body language, your tone of voice, your words chosen, what did you bring into that ecology of communication? What became possible through and impossible through your inputs? Okay, so to think about communication itself as happening in an ecology. Okay, and the big piece there is the difference between looking at communication as what is said or not said, verbally or not verbally, as recognizing that we say things, we do things that we perceive as possible to do in that relationship. Okay, so the way you are with one friend is different than how you are with your mother or your children, right? Because who it's possible for you to be in that relationship has limits, and you're learning to be in that relationship. So an ecology of communication. What's in the ecology of communication? There's a lot to talk about there, and actually we could do that for the whole time, but I want to continue. And one of the things my dad brought in was this word transcontextual. And I've been giving you a little hint to it all along, but this is his word. He says, let me coin the word transcontextual as a genus for this, as a term for this genus of syndromes. it seems that both those whose life is enriched by transcontextual gifts and those who are impoverished by transcontextual confusions are alike in one respect. For them, there's always or often a double take, a falling leaf, the greeting of a friend, or a primrose by the river's brim, is not just that and nothing more. Okay? Exogenous experience may be framed in the context of dream, and internal thought may be projected into the context of the external world, and so on. For all this, we seek a partial explanation in learning and experience. What I'm pointing to here is that it's never just that and nothing more. Okay, we can point to the event, the frozen arm is not just that and nothing more. The way that someone says hello, maybe they haven't said hello like that before. Maybe the way they usually say hello is much warmer, right? Maybe, so looking at whatever the action in the moment is and trying not to get distracted into thinking that's what it is. Because around it, there is all of this information, warm data, transcontextual process that makes it possible for that person to be how they're being, for that society to be in the configuration it is in, for that institution, that organization, that individual. So what I started to realize is that there's a lot of information that we don't consider information. It's not on the books, right? There's a lot of warm data going on. And when my mom, who's 93, when she was sick and the doctor came to her house, he came to her house and he would treat her, but he would also come in her house and he could smell what's cooking. Is the rug clean? Is there fresh air? How do the people interact in this house? Where are they in relationship to their neighbors? Do they have enough money? Right? When you think about health, which is what we've been thinking about for the past couple years, and if you're thinking about care, it's about health of each other, of the system, of our world. That health is completely transcontextual, right? You can't just plant trees. The trees have to be in relationship with mycelia, with other organisms, with the soil, with the particular area they're in, with insects and birds and all sorts of things. How do you care in an ecological way? So for this, I have been working with, I need to share screen again, with warm data. And just as a brief definition, now you can look this up online, there's all kinds of papers everywhere and everything, so you don't have to write anything down. But basically, warm data is the transcontextual information about the interrelationships that integrate a complex system. There's a lot of stuff going on, and you can't measure it, you can't name it, you can't find it or freeze it, you can't repeat it. It's different from different perspectives. Who am I? Well, if you ask my kids, they'll tell you one thing. If you ask Ela, she'll say another thing. If you ask my mother or the next several generations or my dog or who am I? Ask my microbacteria. They have a different description. So the warm data is this recognition that there is this constantly changing, multiple perspective ecology of information that is moving. And ultimately, what's happening is that it's learning. And so I brought in this word, and I want to share this word with you. I started with the Greek for together, and I added the Greek for learning. So sim is together, and matesis is actually learning in Greek. Maybe you know that. I don't know. I didn't. I had to look it up. And I created this word symathesy. because I felt that in the study of systems, we were losing that very important aspect of the fact that they're changing all the time in relation to all the things that are changing all the time. And that is, in fact, a kind of mutual learning. A mutual learning. So semathesy is an entity formed by transcontextual, actually, mutual learning. So I'm a semathesy. You're a semathesy. The city I live in is a semathesy. A forest is a semathesy. A tree is a semathesy. That puppy in the room is a semathesy. The relationship that you have with that puppy is a shared mutual learning semathesy, right? But to pull out of the study of systems that aspect of my relationship with you is changing me. Your relationship with me is changing you a little bit. We are always mutually learning. So semathesy gets at this kind of liminal world of the space in between us, and the way in which that liminality is in constant formation, reformation. Even in the word information, we can see that things are forming in relationship. And if you're walking along in the woods and you come to a crooked tree, okay, and you could look at this crooked tree and you could say, oh my gosh, we have to fix this crooked tree. We must care for this crooked tree. And to think about the ways in which you could make it straight. You could put a bunch of earth underneath it. You could straighten its arms up. You could trim some up, because in other parts of this same environment, the same kind of tree is there, but it's standing straight and tall and healthy. And you think, we need to make this tree as healthy as the other tree. Now, there's all sorts of questions there. I'm not going to get into that bit. But what I want to do is take that question that we got from the paralysis clinic and ask not what's wrong with the tree and how do we fix it, but ask the question, how is the tree learning to be in its world? How is the tree learning to be in its world? Because haven't we all had days like this, right? Periods of life like this, known people who were living like this, where you do what you can with what you got. And the tree is crooked because it's reaching for earth, for light. Where the insects go is a story, and where the earthworms are making the soil nutritious is a story that helps make the roots go in particular directions. And all of these organisms in this picture, they're all learning together how to be in this relationship. And in another part of the same piece of land, there's another whole kind of semathesy going on. So looking at this process it's giving us this entry point to come in without a direct corrective, but instead to look at the conditions, the processes, all of the relationships into which whatever organisms we're working with are learning to be in their world. And what's important is this, I find, fantastic connection between recognizing that learning is not necessarily a good thing. Okay, you can learn to lie. You can learn to be addicted. You can learn to be violent. You can learn to be non-affectionate. You can learn to not care. Right? And so if we look at that definition of pathology as being how an organism is learning to be in its world, what we see is that both the hurting and the healing are learning. The hurting is coming from learning to be in the world in a particular way, and the healing can come by offering new ways to be in the world, new ways of learning. like with this thing, right? Those aspects of the transcontextual processes of those people were learning to be in the world in a new way. And one of the biggest pieces that gets lost is time. There's a lot more I could tell you about somaticity, and I'm going to skip that for today. But the paper's all over the internet, and it's in my book, and it's a big 30-page paper, and you're welcome to go explore it. But I didn't want to leave today without mentioning time, because one of the biggest mistakes we get into is to forget that whatever description we've made of a city, of a family, of a forest, of a situation, that description is probably obsolete by the time you make it. Because all of the organisms are shifting. And this is something that becomes very difficult in terms of thinking about the information and where that information lives in you, how you respond to it, how you are learning with your colleagues together how to respond to it. But it's essential. It's absolutely essential to keep this notion of time with you, because what it does is it reminds us that life is lifing, that things are changing. And it is that very process, that movement, that very aspect of change and learning that is the opening for other change. This is the spot where things can make new things, right? Evolution happens. Okay, so I wanted to start with that. And I'm happy to, hear from any of you if you have any thoughts or questions or inputs or, yeah.
Anyone?
You don't have to speak English. You can actually speak in Slovakian and it'll get translated, right?
Yes, it will.
Yeah. Okay, you're off the hook. If anything comes up, just know I'm here, okay? But when you go have your coffee, dive in and, maybe talk amongst each other a little bit about where we're starting here and how that feels to you. Oh, we have a question. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the fascinating speech. I'm thinking, what would your advice be? What is the smallest little step that we can take to live this, to start living this?
Yeah. I think one, it's that question, right? As you come into a situation, instead of going directly into the description of the problem and the possible solution, to take a step back and ask, how is this situation? How is this person, this family, this thing, how is it learning to be in its world? And let your attention go into that mutual learning process. And it will, even if you don't have a specific answer and you don't know where it's going to go, your approach just shifted. And when your approach shifts, actually, the pathways that open up from there are different pathways, different questions, different whole ways of being. And so this notion of describe the problem, pick an action. And if you think you know what action you're going for, you're liable to actually shut off those possibilities that a different approach could open up for you. And because we have been in a world that is so contaminated with industrial thinking, usually our solutions are for one problem. They have one purpose. This fixes that, right? And that's not how complex living systems work. It just isn't how it works. So whenever we get into that modality, we know that we're going to cause some upset in another direction. I guess I should say that one of my sort of questions and ongoing frustrations in my own work is just watching how most of the things that we are trying to do to make change seem to perpetuate the problems. And so really what I'm kind of getting at here is how I'm working around trying to get into new rhythms, new tonalities, new aspects of the systemic process to produce different outcomes, because we keep making the same system. The system wants to reproduce itself through us. And this deep epistemology is at the heart of that. So that's one thing, is just that question. How is it learning to be in its world? You know, when your kid is completely freaking out and being a complete drag, and you just want to say, sit down and be quiet, to take a step back and say, how is she learning to be in her world right now? And just see what differences you see in your, you know, in your partner.
I had the situation with my kid this morning.
Okay, good. Yep, then you know what I mean.
It took us 2 hours to get
there. And what's happening there, right? And it's really tempting to look at all the things you can see and to point to them and to try to fix them without that thing of, okay, it's not just that and nothing more. Hold on. And that moment, that pause is a moment when your whole, the roads from that pause are totally different roads. They're completely different ways through. So
you balance the pause with the rest, right? You cannot remain in the pause.
No, you can't remain in it, but you can be in it for a minute. Even in the heat of battle, in the heat of the moment, you can wait 1/4 of a second to say, how is it learning to be in its world? How is she learning to be in its world? How are we, what's here? What's around the edges that are creating this shape? Right? My child is a crooked tree this morning. And we all are, you know, we all are. We're several generations deep into all sorts of trauma. We're all crooked trees. So how do we provide care into that space, the conditions in which mutual learning can take place? And one thing about mutual learning is it's not like you're all learning the same thing, okay? It's not as though the earthworm and the tree and the birds are all learning the same thing. No, but they're learning together. When a drought comes, all the organisms are learning together how to be in that drought. Right?
Thank you.